I've been training psychotherapists for 30 years. And in the first 10 years, I spent a lot of time developing these very elaborate theoretical integrations and spent a lot of time with my students giving them these very complex theories of human behavior and psychotherapy. And I noticed that a lot of the people who came in as almost natural helpers started to have less confidence in themselves, started to think about people as it, rather than as statt du oder so. You know, they weren't seeing people as people so much anymore. And then there was certain research that came out that sort of confirmed my intuitions. And, whoops, so is this going to just, oh, takes 3 times. Okay. And that was the research that perhaps many of you know. Probably the most famous people involved in this were Lambert and Bergen. But what they did was they wanted to see what actually makes a difference in the psychotherapeutic process. And they did a meta-analysis of about 40 studies of clinical outcome studies. And they found, the good news was that actually psychotherapy helped, it seemed. But that 40% of the factors that had to do with positive change were totally clients' factors, not factors that had to do with the therapeutic process. But 60%, actually the majority, nice, had to do with things that the therapist did. So what were those things? Interestingly enough, what we spend time at the university is huge amounts of time on theory and some time on skill building. But when you looked at the research, what was the research showing? It showed that half of the therapeutic effect was related to the therapeutic relationship. Now we could intellectually tell them about this, but the qualities of that therapeutic relationship were such that acceptance and non-judgment, unconditional positive regard, mutual affirmation, mutual respect, empathy, and this is empathy in the sense of the key part there was, did the client feel understood? So it wasn't as powerful an indicator if you did raters saying, was this an accurate empathy response or not? What was important was how they felt in the result. Did they feel understood? And then a sense of supporting competence, which is interesting. So also sensing the strength and trusting the ability and the internal capacity of the person. Now, these are not things that you easily teach intellectually. Right? These are states of being. They're things that offer. You can't will yourself to have unconditional positive regard. You can't will yourself not to have judgment. You can try to stop your judgment, but it's a state of mind. And so I said, well, who's good at this? How do we get there? Right? And part of it is through the psychotherapeutic process we can get some of these qualities. But I also realized that certain meditation traditions, particularly Buddhism, was very good at that. So in a sense, also what was that state, that 50%? It was compassionate presence, and it fit exactly with what you're talking about. So it was like, okay, the thing that you're doing is very parallel to creating that state of compassionate presence that I wanted for the therapist to have, and that I started trying to work at ways to develop for the last 20 years. Okay. So, about the time that this research was coming out, I had a chance to go to a weekend with Thich Nhat Hanh. I don't know if you're familiar with the Buddhist teacher, the Vietnamese Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, in New York, where there were 600 people doing a week of Aksam Kai. So this was in the late 80s. And it was a beautiful week. It was at Omega Center in New York. But what was really powerful about that retreat was that in the center of it were 60 American Vietnam veteran soldiers. Soldiers who were carrying the trauma in them of what they had done in the war. And this was 15 years later. And many of them were still not sleeping through the night, right, from what they've done. And he was making it his business to heal our soldiers from what they had done to his country. And I said, I want to know how you get that state of consciousness. How do you get that kind of state of consciousness? Because and also that was in the context of he had worked in Vietnam before he came to the United States and organized thousands of students to go rebuild the villages after we had destroyed them, right? So it wasn't like an abstract idea. Here was a man who had encountered the suffering created by our land and our soldiers and our country, and he was making it his business still to heal us from that. And I was raised as a Christian, and one of the things that we were taught was love your enemy. Doesn't seem to be applied too much these days. But I thought, now that's what that is. That's loving your enemy. You heal their soldiers, because he knew that in those soldiers the seeds of the next war existed. And unfortunately, there weren't enough of the places to heal the soldiers from that we haven't continued to do that. And we're, unfortunately, as an American, it's very sad to see that we're continuing to do very similar things that we did then. But it only deepens my determination to do whatever we can and whatever I can for peace work and understand at the levels that I can touch peace in the world. So it was very important to me to try and understand how he could create the state of mind that would allow him to encounter the suffering without burning out. Because what I was noticing from my students were they were graduating all enthusiastic to get out there. They were starting to do therapy. They were running into the realities of the trauma that their clients were experiencing, and they were burning out, right? And I was thinking, we're not doing anybody a service here if we can't help them to not burn out. And the other thing is to help them have the conditions, the therapeutic conditions. And even if we can get them to have those therapeutic conditions for a little while, how do we get them to do that sustainably? And I think that's part of my interest here is how do you develop these qualities sustainably? Not that they're temporarily there, but they're there over time. So that's really been my work. Now, what was very interesting is at the same time that I got to know Thich Nhat Hanh's work, I was introduced to the internal family systems model. Now, my training background included a lot of different models. So I was trained in the Carl Rogers Client-Centered, I was trained in cognitive behavioral, and my doctoral studies were largely in psychodynamic ego psychology and object relations theory. I never felt like, okay, that wasn't enough, let's learn this, that wasn't enough, let's learn some more, let's learn some more. I kept looking for the magic pill, I guess. And you know, we all find the model eventually that fits us well, or integrate and create our own model that fits us well. But in the late 80s, I came across this internal family systems model. And my wife is a family therapist, and she had run into Richard Schwartz, who was a very famous family therapist in the United States in the 80s. And his book is still used today in family therapy classes. And he had, out of his systems background, created an individual model, which is this internal family systems model. And as I trained with him in the late 80s, I was delighted to find that when I got to this workshop with Thich Nhat Hanh, that he presented a Buddhist model of consciousness that fit perfectly together. So that's what I'm going to start with. I will start with how it started for me, where this Buddhist perspective and the internal systems comes together. And then we'll largely talk about that in terms of the internal systems model. And I tend to use the term internal systems rather than internal family systems. I've never been very fond of the family part of the internal systems because it doesn't seem structured that way. There's not two parents and a child and the parents are in charge. It's a little different than that. So I just say internal systems, but it definitely comes from Richard Schwartz's work. But at the same time, there are many models now arising of this that deal with the multiplicity of people. In Germany, a very popular one is the ego state therapy of Watkins, because the psychoanalytic people are more comfortable with that model. Schutz von Thun has a model of his inner team that they work with here, which is very interesting work and also quite compatible with this. There's both of those have some fairly major differences. One really major difference from the internal family systems model. There's voice dialogue, there's psychosynthesis, there's just a lot of models. And it seems like right now internal family systems has been kind of slow to grow until the last 5 years when it's just exploded in the United States, and especially on the East Coast around Harvard and those areas, because there's been some really important outcome studies that have shown, actually in this study they were doing it with rheumatoid arthritis, and I think the pharmaceutical company thought, yeah, internal family systems, let's have that be our therapeutic control. That sounds pretty strange. And it turns out that this psychological intervention had more impact on physical symptoms than any study that had shown any therapeutic model before. So
Did they publish that?
it's coming. You know how that takes? The study was done 2 years ago and it's still in back, you know. But it's coming and it should be out soon. I'll have to check and see when it's out, but it's definitely coming. In any case, it shows a strong effect, and it's always nice to have the science begin to validate what one's experiencing, you know, and that was also part of, let's see what science can do to validate and also broaden our understanding of these processes. Okay, so this is how, the other thing that allows me to do this PowerPoint today is the fact that I'm going to use a lot of illustrations. And in teaching this model, I find it almost essential to use pictures. Otherwise, you have to go in and really have people experience it, or they don't seem to understand it very well. So fortunately, we have a wonderful artist who was a student of mine, and I'll talk a little bit more about her later, but she illustrated this for me. So Thich Nhat Hanh said, okay, in Buddhist understanding of consciousness, there's two major levels of consciousness that especially are easy to understand in the West. One is what they call store consciousness. That's in Sanskrit is alaya, in German Speicherbewusstsein. Right? It's where all of the seeds, according to the Buddhists, the seeds, die Samen, from Bewusstseinszustände, from mental formations, in English the Buddhists would say mental formations, are stored. And those are there because of all of the genetic history, the cultural history, the family history, the personal history. They all have to do with creating what kinds of seeds are in this Speicherbewusstsein, the store consciousness. And what they say is that and then up here in the top level is everyday consciousness. It's where your consciousness currently is focusing its attention. Okay. There are 6 other levels of consciousness in the Buddhist tradition, and what's the beauty of Thich Nhat Hanh is that he's simplified it down, and that's what I'm going to share. Okay. So what he says is that when the internal conditions, so the internal conditions of the person, and the external conditions are right, some kind of Bewusstseinszustand, some kind of state of consciousness will arise into to this everyday consciousness. So right now, perhaps, because we're still in the first 10 minutes of my talking, in your consciousness is a part, something like this, that's still somewhat interested in what I'm saying. This is a very useful part to have in your consciousness, useful for me and useful for you, because if you're in this consciousness, you can learn what's going on, right? So my understanding, and we call these the parts in IFS, the parts of us, my understanding of that is that it's states of consciousness that exist across time in our life that are designed to give us the state of consciousness we need to cope effectively with the internal and external conditions. The innere and äußere Bedingungen. Yeah? That's how this helps. So it's also possible that there's another state of consciousness in you right now, maybe one like this, which is a little skeptical and saying, oh man, Buddhist psychology, Where is this coming from, you know? And it's also useful to have a part like this in your system, right? You need to be a little skeptical. And it's fine to have both there, right? Maybe this one a little more in the foreground will be easier for me, but it's also it's also okay if the other one is there, right? So we need both states of consciousness there. Now, one of the things that I had to do sometimes at the university was I mostly taught graduate students. But sometimes I had to go down and teach the big sections of some undergraduate sections who wanted a lecture and this or that. And if I had the bad luck to be giving that lecture on Friday morning, I don't know about here, but in the United States, Thursday night is kind of party time in the United States. And sometimes, instead of having that student part in the Vorlesungssaal, I had this part there, right? And this part was not so easy to teach. And this part, this state of consciousness was there because there were some other parts the night before that had taken over the living room of their consciousness for quite some time, right? And they didn't get home till 4 o'clock, and you know, but still, because there was another part of them saying, you have to get there, there's going to be a test next week, you know, and if you get enough coffee in your system, I think you can at least have a little bit of your student part present that day. Okay? So, obviously we have different parts of us, different ego states, and different needs and different balances in our system. The other thing about parts, and this is like apropos of the coffee, like the coffee helps us to have an internal condition that is a little more conducive to certain types of paying attention tasks that we need, right? So obviously I like to see parts of us, these ego states, as a type of biopsychosocial software. It's a software program that's amazing. It's way beyond the software that we're writing because it writes itself. It's built into the genetic code, and it writes itself as the person has experiences through their life. Now we have certain sets of software that have certain roles, and that software will evolve uniquely in each person, and in other words, create the types of parts that they need in order to adapt and cope with their particular life situation. Now what we've noticed is that there are 4 levels, that you might say levels, to these different parts, these different ego states. There's usually a bodily, sensational level. It shows up somehow in the body. There's an emotional level to it. There's a verbal or cognitive level. And there's can be an imagery level to it. Now those levels can also be called, they're kind of doorways, or they're ways that this part of our system communicates with us. So if it's a feeling, what do feelings do? It says, hey, it gives you, pay attention to something. It's a signal from the system to say, pay attention to something. So all of these, body tension, the words that come into your head, they're all signals from these software systems, hey, pay attention to something, right? Or let's get into a state of mind where we can accomplish what we need to do zurechtzukommen, this Mittelbedingung, to come into the right relationship to our surroundings. So, in this model, health is when we get the right Bewusstseinszustand, the right state of consciousness in the living room at the right time. Right? That the system can easily move in, and that those states of consciousness, those Bewusstseinszustände, have the right attributes for us to effectively deal with the situation that we're facing. Now, let's see, what did I do? All right. So that was part of my, I already did that. These are notes to myself many times. I wanted to, I guess I felt a little bit of need to say, I felt the question coming from the audience, why do we have to talk about them as parts? And what we use as the word for them is something that, and what you use as the word for you in your study is something that you can kind of arrive at. Anteilen oder teilen, parts of English, but ego states, Rolle. Rolle I find a little disconcerting in English in that roles are usually used as kind of more sociological terms and have to do with the outer environment and not so much with the inner environment. So I don't know, maybe in German it doesn't have that same influence, but it does. Yeah, yeah. So part of it depends on, okay, what do we want to focus on now is one, but the word, the parts for me are relate more to the fact that this goes through the whole levels of our system more than just the external level. But and then I already talked about the software. Aha, wait a minute here. Okay, let's not be scared. Normally what I do about this point is I just kind of charge along in my talk with the kind of introduction of the various types of parts in our system. And I thought, I wasn't sure if it might not be useful, I guess why in terms of parts, is to talk about the therapy process itself. So I'm kind of looking at, is it useful to talk about how the therapy works, or can we do that late towards the end? Are you all ready to go along with it? Are you ready to buy it as it is right now? And then I'll just go through on this more. I have one of the reasons, I guess the other reason that I was interested in your study was much of my work has had to do with training therapists, but I've also had an interest in having this information available to the broader public. And that's why I wrote the book the way I did. It's a book that's designed really for the broad public. And this talk is one which easily can relate to the broad public. And so I'm just going to go in that direction. And if we want to talk more about the therapeutic process, we can do it later. The main thing that I wanted to say there is that this is a very powerful model of psychotherapy. It's the most powerful model of psychotherapy I've experienced. And it's also a very powerful model to allow us to get into that state, the therapist to get into the state, where they can encounter suffering from really a place of peace and compassion. And the most rewarding thing that happens for me is that after people have gone through the series of workshops that I do on this, they come back and they say, you know, my whole work as a therapist has changed. It used to be I was grinding it out, it was this work, I was slogging through it. And now it's a joy. I just go in and I accompany people through the process. And that's really the goal of my work when I'm working with therapists. So that's I just want to say, even though I'm going to give kind of a superficial and sometimes funny way of talking about this, it has a very serious and deep side to it. So that was the main thing I wanted to say there. Right? That capacity to be with suffering is absolutely essential for therapists, because you're encountering immense trauma all the time if you're working deeply with people. Yeah. Okay. So this part of us, we probably know, it's pretty basically built into the core of our system, right? This is the fear response, right? And a very important part of us is that we have fear at the right time. This particular drawing comes out of a little story in the book that has to do with, I went to New York City with my teacher who was going to be singing at Carnegie Hall. We were 14 years old, and he brought 3 of us guys with him, and we're running around Central Park at 1 o'clock in the morning. And maybe unlike Leipzig now, at New York City at 1 o'clock in the morning in Central Park is not a good thing to be doing, especially in the 60s, right? It was very dangerous. But we didn't know enough to be afraid. So we have to have rechtzeitig, müssen wir diese Furchtteile in Vordergrund. Yeah? So I'm sure my mother would have been very able to get that in her foreground if she had been around me. She would not have let this go away, right? So it's very important that we have this response so that we can have this response or this response, right? So we all know about the fear, flight, flight reaction, and obviously that is a software program that will take over the whole system when it needs to. It will wipe out all other systems that are currently operating. Right? So it's very powerful. One of the reasons it's useful to conceptualize it in the parts way is that what happens is the parts store memories. So like this is an example of a child part, and when you're working as a therapist, what you have is these states of consciousness that are very childlike in people, that are storing memories of danger, of fear, of bad things that happen, and they keep repeating those stories to the system whenever like conditions arise. Right? The problem is that they're storing memories from the vulnerability of that child in that time, and they're usually covered up with protector parts, right, which are keeping those traumatic memories and pains out of consciousness. So in the therapeutic process, it's what you do is you need to stabilize the system, and we'll talk about later how you do that from the therapeutic point of view. But the thing to know here is that the reason it's useful to talk about parts is because this software of parts allows us to communicate with those fear systems and to soothe them. And it's through the process of encountering from the proper states of mind these images which will arise into people's consciousness as children, and you can soothe those children, and then that whole memory set can go away. Right? So we know that memories, once they're retrieved, are malleable for a period of time. If you can recondition the response set to those memories, that whole area of tension that's driving a lot of the force of the system can be changed. These slides were put in there, I'm remembering now, when I thought I was going to talk about the therapy, so I had to do it anyway. Right? But that's one of the importances. Okay, so these parts, my understanding is, and this is where I've been trying to tie it together neurologically, is that these parts store memory, behaviors, responses across the life sequence in this software design so that the system can rapidly respond to situations without having to sort of go through the whole loop and relearn that process. Right? And to me, what the parts are is they're stable structures that have been designed to cope with particular internal states and external states rapidly. And the problems come when those parts are doing things that are no longer effective, that were learned at one time. They were maybe effective at 5 years old. They're not effective at 65 years old. Right? But they're still driving the system because they haven't had a chance to relearn. And I see a lot of what psychotherapy is, if you want to use the software analogy, is it's updating the software. It's just updating the software and also reconditioning it. So, back to my normal sequence here. I'd like to try, and one of the things I like about this model is that I've been able to relate it to the psychodynamic, to the cognitive behavioral, to the object relations theory. I can relate it to all of those. And I thought I would spend just a little bit of time kind of looking at, okay, what if we looked at parts from a bit of the Freudian perspective, right? So we know in the Freud system we have the id, the ego, and the superego. And it works better in German for some of my my wordplay fun parts if we use the German words, which are the es, the ich, and the über-ich, right? So I want to first talk about those S-Teilen, right? Because they're a very important function, and really the ones that I already showed about the fight or flight also probably reside in that S-Gebiet, that S area. But the other, one of my other favorite S-Tiles is this one here. And this part, the happy pig, comes from my wife Lori, who suggested this as a good representation. She called it her happy pig. In German, we've used the word Genussschwein. And this is the part, it's a very important job. This part's job is to recognize, oh, there's hunger there. And this is what Freud would say, you know, that the id's job is to recognize need states and to bring those enough into consciousness, and he would say that the ego takes care of it, and then in terms of dealing with the reality parts of those issues. I find that that my happy pig is very well able to cope with reality. It can operate without really talking to the parts that are more managerial or and still take care of itself. But in any case, this particular software's job is to recognize needs, give us some nice ideas about what would taste good, right? And then to give us the motivation to get out there and get it, right? And this part can operate in the living room, so consciously, or it can operate unconsciously. Like, this is why I say it doesn't necessarily need at least a conscious ego part there, because you often find that maybe while you were worrying about some problem at work, you had very well found the cookie jar and had 3 cookies down before you even thought about it, right? So these parts can operate fully out of consciousness as well, right? And the happy pig is quite good at that. Okay, now there are other parts, and now obviously if this part isn't there, we die, right? So it's pretty important. Have you ever been on a fast before, you know, where you didn't eat? What happens? This part gets a little worried, right? It starts going, hungry, 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 right? And so then the next meal time, it does it again, and then it kind of gives up for a while, until maybe an hour or so before you're going to end the fast. Then this part jumps into the living room and says, oh man, I can't wait to get home and have this and this and this, right? Right? So this part is built into the system in such a way that it will force itself into the living room if you don't take care of it. All right. And there are other parts, and so this part is a very core survival part. Another survival part for the species is sexuality, right? If the sexual parts don't come into the living room at the right time for enough people, right, humanity doesn't go anymore, right? So this was built pretty powerfully into the software system to take over, right? So in fact, it was built in so powerfully that it has lots of other uses that the sexual energy and the sexual drive can be used for, and that's what we notice both with the fear, with the hunger, and particularly with sexual drive. Those can be attached for other purposes of living and adaptation. Certainly advertisers know that if they want to get people to look at something, they push the button to activate this part. Now, if we have our happy pig wanting to go to McDonald's and pig out, or we have our sexual parts becoming too active, we're likely to have some other part come into our system, right? And say, wait a minute, McDonald's, are you kidding? You know, or nude people on the screen in a lecture, what are you doing here, you know? So these are the Über-Ich-Teil. And these are parts, software that's specifically designed to absorb the expectations of the environment around it. So they absorb parental expectations, they absorb social expectations. It changes over the developmental phase. In the teen years, they absorb peer expectations, diminished parental expectations. But these parts are there with that specific job, right? So this is where we get our inner critics, our inner judges, our perfectionist parts, or our sacred holy parts, right? These are all of the parts of us that are written to give us those messages. Now the problem is with any parts, these parts can get extreme, right? And they can cause a lot of suffering and distress in our life, right? So this is maybe what we call an extreme superego structure, right? And one of the things that we'll look at one of the nice things about it being a systems theory is that you also can deal with polarizations and all of the systems dynamics. So we know that whenever one part of the system gets extreme in one direction, there's very likely to be an opposite somewhere in the system. Maybe a part like that, right? That doesn't particularly buy what the superego parts were saying. You know, a nice rebel part. Now, these rebel parts also have important jobs in the system. In fact, one of the things that we'll notice is that all of the parts of us have a function. They're all originally there to solve a particular problem in living. Right? That's why they're there. So what is the job of this rebel part? And when does it come into consciousness normally?
Well, to not obey when something is just unbearable.
All right, so not to obey. When do the rebellious ego states take over a lot of the living room in the Entwicklungsprozess, right, in developmental process?
In puberty.
Puberty, right. It like just, the hormonal, however the organism organizes it, it takes over a lot of room. Why? What's its job? Not just to make the parents suffer, I think, right? This was some sort of grand universal design to say, let's have the parents suffer when the teenagers are.
Develop autonomy.
To develop autonomy, exactly. You need to push against the internalizations from the parents, push against the internal images that you've held as parents, so that you can find your own identity and autonomy. And if you don't have that, then it's likely that you might not find your own special identity. You'll just swallow the identity that was given to you. On the other hand, just like with all parts, some parts don't like to leave the living room once they're there. Now, you may know some people for whom this part takes up a lot of the living room. They might be 60, 70 years old, and still this part is the primary part in their living room, right? That's not bad or good, right? But it does limit the space in life for other types of parts to do their thing and for other life options. Okay. There are obviously other parts that are less problematic, can have fun, important to have these parts come out periodically. Now, the children parts, this is kind of where a lot of people started. You know, they had the inner child. And I was talking with Louisa Redeman, and she was saying that early on in their work, they thought there was one inner child. And they would work with this inner child, and they would heal the inner child. And next week, there was another inner child that was wounded. And it was like, wait a minute, we already fixed that, you know. It turns out there are more than one inner child, that there are a variety of states of mind. And these are also ego states that are very important to have. Now, this particular ego state is one that wants approval from the parents, right? Now, as a grandparent of a 4-year-old, I am happy if this part comes into the living room of my grandson sometimes, right? Where he wants to be nice to grandpa, right? So this is obviously a very important part in keeping a relationship between the caregiver, the nurturing caregiver, and the child healthy, right? And we have other parts that maybe carry other feelings of vulnerability or sadness. They carry a lot of the emotional parts are often appear in people's psyche as children. Kuschelig Teile, the parts that like to snuggle, right? I mean, we also need those ego states. And sometimes the more vulnerable ego states feel childlike to us, and maybe we push them away because of that. They can either stay in child form, or they can become adults and still like to be kuschelig, right? Oh my God. If we have vulnerable child parts, though, then we have another type of ego structure that comes into the living room of consciousness. And these are the protector parts. These are the ones that say, wait a minute, I'm not going to let this little kid part come out into the foreground and get hurt. And we've all run into other people's protectors when we've intentionally or unintentionally threatened their system, right? And it can be, you know, a bit tough when you run into people who are armored in that way. One of the important things to remember is that whenever people are really armored, gepanzert, right, there's also usually a strong vulnerability behind it. And the more they're protected, almost the more that vulnerability is there. But you don't overcome it by attacking the armor, obviously. That just creates the more scenario. I like to use this particular dynamic as a way of talking about how this individual systemic structure parallels the broader social structures. So if we look at a cultural situation like in the United States, when 9/11 happened and the Twin Towers were destroyed, fear, right? Fear comes into the living room. Oh my gosh, we're vulnerable. We've never really been attacked that way before. Everybody has fear. But shortly thereafter, this part comes into the living room. He already was there a lot for us, but now he's really hard to get out of the living room. And it continues 10 years later to dominate where we're pouring the energy of our country. Our budget for the military is bigger than the next 5 countries all combined, right? So that's the other thing, is that when you're defended, a lot of your even personal energy goes into those defensive structures that are protecting you, so you don't have energy for other aspects of your life. And the same thing as the country, when we're pouring so much money into our defensive structures, we don't have money for health care, for schools, for doing the basic things that would bring up the quality of life. So if you go to our country, you'll also notice that there are anyway extremes in rich and poor, but they're getting greater now because the money's less, because the money's going there, into the Panzer. And it's not even a question. I mean, you can't even question that as a politician. If you question military spending, you are a complete outsider in our political system at this point, right? So, as a peace activist, it's hard not to get angry, right? But anger is not going to help, right? And when Thich Nhat Hanh came to the United States in the 60s and started working with the peace movement, he says, whoa, you guys are angry. He says, I think you need to go home and practice mindfulness. He says, because if you don't know peace in you, you're not going to be able to make a difference of peace in the world. And I take that very seriously, and I see that that bringing of peacefulness into ourselves is a part of our own system, that the more we can do whatever activism we do with a balance, we're not going to activate more polarization in the system. All right. Where do we go from here? Let's see. Okay, this is the, you know, in different cultures, these protectors and different people will show up in different ways. I liked, Sharon, the artist's view of this kind of American Texas protector over there. I think George Bush was president at the time. The eyes of this one here are kind of good too, because if you look at the eyes, you can really see the fear behind that panzer. Yeah. All right. Then we have some parts that I call more manager parts. These are the ones that you can fall into the ich, or the ego state. These are the reality-oriented parts. They get things done, right? They see what needs to be done. And in this day and age, that means they're working pretty hard, right? So this multitasker is one of my favorite parts. There are different manifestations of this part here, especially as the multiple job roles come into one's lives. Yeah, you can see that. So, it's not easy to be a manager in this life, and especially I think for women, where the roles have not dropped as the other roles have increased. But everybody can feel a little overloaded by that. And it seems a little bit of a vulnerable space sometimes. Okay. But we also have our more happy managers that can come in and make lists. You got to get things done, got a list for this, got a list for that. We have the managers that can give direction, say, can you do this, can you do that, can you do this, can you do that? It's useful to have these parts in your system. Actually, as a director, this was one that I didn't have easily when I was a department chair, and that was a problem, right? Because my helper part was a little bigger than my delegator, and that's not good, right? You need the delegator in the system. So sometimes you have to really have support in strengthening certain parts that were underdeveloped in your system. And then we have our helping parts, especially in parental situations. We have the parts of us that are activated for nurturing. Key again in the survival of the species, that they're there. And now in the helping professions, we have our helping parts that are gut ausgebildet, to be ready for all situations that might occur. They take workshops, they go to trainings, they get various degree after degree, different models of therapy, right? But just like with any part, these helping parts can become extreme as well, right? And really get overloaded. Now, one of the things that we'll see, obviously I think this part might be burning out pretty soon. And a lot of people will come to the point in therapy where they're taking all of those things that happen, they take them home with them, they stay in their mind, they're burdened by them. And it feels like this, and especially in today's world, if you're also sensitive to the environment or to the hunger in Africa or wherever, it can be an overload on your system. And I suppose this is your empathic resonance part of things, and this guy had maybe a little too much there. And we'll look at also, but even this one here, this guy is not necessarily the best. This is not the best place to be a therapist from. You know, if we're being a therapist from the helper part, the problem with that is that it requires that the person that you're working with need help, and that what you're doing then is activating in their system the needy parts, right? And so it limits the range of parts that they can have in their system if you come from here, as well as it leads to burnout, and it's just simply not as effective. We'll talk later about the best place to come from. Okay. So then the other group of parts that we haven't talked about are the exiles. And these parts are the parts that have been cast deep down into the memory system of the, because they carry usually pain, or because they were put on extinction or punishment in various life circumstances. So these are the parts of us that are kept out of even getting close to the living room of consciousness. Because were they to come up into the living room, and we have a special part, there's a certain type of manager part that's job is to keep feelings down. It's part of the emotional regulation part. It's let's keep those painful feelings away so we can function in everyday life. But the reality is these managers can't always do their job because something is going to happen in our environment where these parts, the buttons are pushed and these parts come up into the living room, they threaten to flood the system. And when they threaten to flood the system feels this is an intolerable feeling. And this is particularly useful in understanding situations like the diagnostic category of the borderline personality disorder, where the person will go into very self-destructive behaviors. And in this model, the internal family systems model, those self-destructive behaviors are called firefighters. And what happens is when something happens, like particularly with the borderline patient, an abandonment fear happens. So something activates, presses the button of the abandonment feeling. And abandonment is probably one of the worst emotional states that a person can experience. Right? It's built into our system to be something that probably as mammals leads to death, right, if you're abandoned by the caregivers. So it's built very powerfully into our system, and it's an intolerable feeling. So rather than have that feeling in there, they might cut themselves, they'll do something to flood the states of consciousness with another sensory stimulus. They can also drink, they can also binge eating, they can do a lot of things to fill the living room up with another stimulus set so that that unwanted fear is not there. Obviously, that's not a good way of regulating your emotions because the system is destructive to the system. But it's an emergency method for that. And that's the way that, so that's the way these self-destructive behaviors are seen as emergency methods for coping with the system being flooded with intolerable affect. Okay, so again, health is when we can get the right parts into the living room at the right time. We get the right parts of us into the foreground at the time that they're needed. I've added this circle recently to the drawing. This is another state of consciousness in Buddhism. It's called the manas. And these are actually the habits that happen automatically without us knowing them. And they see that as a source of a lot of suffering. But there's sort of a mid-level state of consciousness. So there's not just stored things and then things that are in our active awareness. There's all those things that we do automatically, probably both, not just physiologically, but psychologically automatically. The other thing that Thich Nhat Hanh says is that this living room is like a garden. And you can water the seeds of consciousness that you want there. So in the Buddhist tradition, they like to say, look, what do you want to have in your living room? Because you want to be careful about who you invite into your living room, because it's hard to get them out. Right? So he was not a big fan, let's say, of the Gestalt techniques of beating pillows, because he says, well, the longer that anger just sits up there, fully taking over the living room, when it'll just come back down here and sit right here, then it's going to be real easy to get back up there. So it's interesting, the Buddhists kind of knew what I think we know neurologically now, that if a behavior has been very present, a state of consciousness very present, it's easy to get it back up into the foreground of the state of consciousness. So you want to be careful. He says, like, it's sort of like, you know, the CD that you use all the time. The ones that you've used recently are right on top, and you're likely to grab them again and put them into your recorder, right? It's bringing awareness and attention to what's in the living room is important. Okay. Now, so again, getting the right part in the living room at the right time. It's not always so easy, right? So this is not a part. It looks like a part, but it's not, because it's outside the circle here. So this is actually just a stimulus situation. A little boy waiting for his mom to come home. Who will be in mom's living room when she arrives? Uh-oh. Not that manager. And she comes in and she says, have you done your homework? Have you done this? Have you cleaned your room? Have you done this and that? And that's not what he was maybe hoping for. He might have been wanting a part that could go like this, right? And say, hi, how you doing? It's not always easy to move out of one part to the other, right? So that can take some time to move into the state of mind that is going to be maybe the optimal one. It's also important for a parent to be able to have the part that can tell their kids what to do and set limits. So both parts are needed. Sometimes it's easy to get the part in the living room. So here, if you see a baby like this, now I've had young grandchildren recently, and if I go to the grocery store with these young grandkids in arm, I walk past people, they're walking around like this, then they see the kid and they go, oh, all of a sudden they're in this amazing change of state of mind where they're drawn to a nurturing kind of behavior. It's amazing how that software is built into the program. It's easily activated. A good thing, because if it wasn't, humans don't exist anymore. Right? So it's built in, but this is not the only ego state in a baby. And as some of your studies have shown too, there are other ego states that babies have, like crying. And those behaviors can be a little more difficult for the system to respond to in terms of positively, right? So this dance between the parts, now, it's a little, especially if there's, let's say there's something wrong with the stomach of the child and he's been crying all night and you're not sleeping sowieso nicht so viel, and you're really tired, it gets harder and harder to have that nurturing part there, and the worried, stressed out, exhausted parts come into the living room. But obviously it's very important that this cry is distressful to the parent, right? I mean, this is probably your standard social neurology. stuff here, and that you can look at how does these dances between the systems activate parallel parts. And that's, from the parts perspective, that's what we would say. This part activates that part, which activates this behavior, da 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 da. So, all right. Again, getting the right part in the living room at the right time. Fortunately, there is another dimension to the psyche that makes it a lot easier. And that dimension in this model is called self or selbst, right? And it's a really confusing term. Self is like hopeless almost to try and clarify. It's worse than empathy or something. Because what is self? And so sometimes I call this the center or the Mitte, you know. Let's just describe it as its function first, and then we can figure out what to call it. So this is a meta-ebene. It's a meta level. From this place of the system, one can view the other levels of the system. So it's a little bit like the main menu in the computer. From this main menu, you have access to all of the programs that you need, to all of the parts. So if you have access to the main menu, to the center, you can easily move from one part to the other. Now, if you've been working with your computer, you may have sometimes gotten caught in a program, right? So you can't get out. You can't get back to your main menu. What do?
Press escape.
Well, escape is not going to do much if you're frozen, right? Reset. I don't know what it's called in German. Reset. Yeah. Neustarten, whatever it is. Yeah. So you shut it down, and then you hope that the main menu is there when you come back, right? Sometimes it isn't. Most of the time it is. Now, any parent knows this with children, right? So you have this kid, and you're trying to do the things that you normally do to say, hey Johnny, let's go do this, or let's go do that, or let's go do this. And usually they'll get excited when you say that, and they'll go do that. But sometimes it's like, no, I don't wanna, you know, and they're grumpy, and they're crying, and they're tired. You realize suddenly they haven't had their nap, right? They take a nap, boom, reset button. Back up to the main menu. They wake up from their nap, and you ask them if they want to do that. Oh yeah, it's easy then to get them into the right states of mind. The right parts are available at that point. A really interesting thing, I think, is how we help people to find the reset space. How they find the center again, how they find their main menu. And I think, and this what we're calling self is like that. If we can get back to center, then the flow of the personality then moves in the way that it needs to move in a much better way. Another way of looking at the self is as the compassionate witness. You know, so in Buddhism it would just be your compassion.